A couple weeks ago I spoke at SharePoint Saturday Toronto, the 2012 edition. It was a great time and I presented on the content query web part. There's a few questions that came up and people wanted a resource that they could look to after they had gone home and something they could pass around to their colleagues. So I'm going to create a series of videos about the content query web part and how to use it. This first video I'm going to talk about just adding it, how to use it out of the box. Then we're going to go into some details later on how to customize it. And finally, I'd like to do some videos on how to properly deploy it. So to start with, I've got a SharePoint Online site. It's very typical, just a normal team site. This is one of the E-plans, and you'll need to have publishing enabled on your site for this to work, because the content query web part is part of the publishing feature. I've created a special content type for SharePoint Saturday called SPS Toronto Document. You'll notice it's pretty simple. There's simply a title, a form department, and a description. The form department was a custom column that I added. Description was one of the existing site content types. I've used that content type and added it to a few document libraries around the site. You'll see here I've created a set of forms that you might have to fill in a normal organization, the IT form, gym membership, coffee requisition, that sort of thing. That's on the main site itself, and then on a sub-site within that, just a sub-site, I have another document library with the same content type. Now, this is great that all these documents are there and have their proper metadata associated with them, but it can be hard to aggregate them together, especially across the site collection. That's where the content query web part comes in. So what I've done is I have this page waiting for me, and if I start editing it, I'll be able to add a content query web part to it. So we're going to add it just to the top header section. And on SharePoint Online you get this dialog box that pops up instead of maybe the normal content query web part or the normal web part editor that you would see. So if we look under content rollup, you'll see the content query. So we want to add that to the page. So it's added to the page, and we don't have anything configured yet, so it won't show anything. Just like any web part, we have to open the tool pane, and then we start dealing with the actual details of the content query web part itself. So let's start with the query. This is where you configure what you want to bring back. You have three options. You can show, or you have to define the scope. You can define just showing everything in the site collection. You can narrow it down to just a specific site and sub-site, or you can even target just a specific list. Now, this might not make a lot of sense for aggregation, but sometimes you want to use the content query web part even if there isn't a large number of documents available. And you might need to target it because the content query web part only supports up to 1,000 lists. So if you have a large site collection with many lists and libraries, it won't work. So we're going to show it from all sites in this site collection. I've been adding my documents to a document library, so we'll set that. And then this is where we start defining exactly what content type I want specifically. So under the custom content type groups is my SPS Toronto document. So why don't we add that and hit apply. So the page is now refreshed, and you'll see that all of my documents are now on the page. But not actually all of my documents. I actually had 16 documents, and I chose that number because by default the content query web part will show 15 documents. Important to note, paging isn't built into the content query web part. It's a rather painful deficiency, and people come up with client-side solutions to hide that sometimes, but it isn't out of the box to do paging. So maybe I want to show just a specific subset of my SPS Toronto documents. That's where I would start using filters. Now the easiest way to define a filter is simply to select the column that I want to filter on. In this case, let's look at the form department, which is defined on my content type, and set it to IT. And if we hit apply, our page will load. And now we see only the documents that were tagged with IT. Now this is okay, but it is fairly restrictive in that you're stuck to do only the IT forms for this page. So if you want to show something a little more dynamically, you can get a little hint from this question mark box. Now there are two types of dynamic filtering available. You can either use a page field value, so if your page has metadata associated with it, you can use that to show just the documents of a certain type. I'm not a huge fan of this because it does ultimately restrict you to something at design time. What I really like is the page query string filter. What that allows me to do is define a query string parameter, and when the document is, or when the page loads with that query string present, it will filter based on that value. So let's copy this down. And we're going to call our query string department, just EPT. So now, if we apply that, page will re-render, and you'll see something in the content query web part. There are no documents shown. That's because our page doesn't have that filter value currently. So what we need to do is add a query string. So if we set dept IT, dept equals IT, hit enter, our page will load with only the IT documents. Now this isn't the filtering that I had set up previously, this is dynamic. So I can go back into edit mode in the page, and I'm going to edit this content query web part a little further. So you can query on a number of types of documents, you can change the scope to reflect what you want, and you can set up filters to even further define that. Importantly, you can also add extra filters beyond the singular. Now we want to change how the content query web part looks. Now we have a couple levels of doing this. At the start, we can group the documents together. Now let's say I want to show them by their form department. Apply again. And now you'll see that the documents are grouped according to their department. In this case, I don't want to group. I want to sort by the date they were created, which is the default. So I'll leave that as is, but I want to do it with the newest documents first. Then we get down to the individual item style, and this is where you can start customizing a little more heavily. So we've defined the group style as being the default, which is going to look like this, but we can also choose larger text, smaller text, banded, a number of different things. I'll show you later in another video how to edit these. But for now, let's take a look at some of the individual item styles. So this is going to render how an individual document shows up. So we have image on left, title and description, title only, title with background, a whole bunch of options. These are defined in a XSL style sheet in your style library for the site. So you'll see down here what is populating the fields that this item style has defined. So I want to show the description because my document type had a description field. So let's set that and then apply. Well, that's strange. There isn't a description here. Well, if you go over and look at the settings, you'll notice this description column. It's set to a field called comments. Despite the fact that the item style is title and description, it needs to be told what exactly the description will be. In our case, my content type doesn't have a comments field. It has a description field, so we'll add that. And apply that once more. Well, that's strange. It's still not there. Well, that's because the document or that column actually isn't called description. Because it's a built-in column and exists in a column group, I actually have to be a little more specific about what I'm looking for. And to get some details on that, if you click on the question mark, it'll give you the more details about how exactly you need to write it out. To get the column defined, you would need to give the column name and in square brackets the column group. I'm actually not a huge fan of this method because you then have to know what the column group is, and sometimes that gets lost in the content type hierarchy. What I prefer to do is get the internal name. Now, to do that, right click on the column name in the content type and select properties. If you drag down the address URL, you'll see a field name. This is the field, this is actually the internal field name within SharePoint. So in our case, it's called the routing rule description. Cancel out of that. And over here, we'll set our description to be routing rule description. We apply that. And now you'll see that the description is included in our content query web part. And if you scroll down a little further, you'll notice that it has given the name for you in the column square brackets column group format. So that's great, but I want to make this look a little more custom. So in a future video, I'm going to show how to customize the item, the overall look and feel, as well as how to deploy this properly. Thanks.